Given the comic book nature of wrestling, it's not unusual for someone to have an alter ego. After all, if it works for Bruce Wayne or Peter Parker, then why can't it work for someone who makes their living in the squared circle as well? Well, in many cases it has, but which of these were the best of all? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into Mystery Men, wrestling's greatest alter egos. And if we're going to start somewhere, where better than with a man who, over the course of his illustrious career, had not just one great alter ego, but three of them. Who is this? Mick Foley, of course. Yes, Mrs. Foley's baby boy may now be better known to fans by his real name, but early on in his career, he would wrestle for the likes of World Championship Wrestling and Extreme Championship Wrestling under the different moniker of Cactus Jack. And Cactus Jack was presented as being the most sadistic performer in the industry throughout this period, someone who was willing to absolutely destroy his body with every implement imaginable should it get him the win. No greater example of this would there be, in fact, than the time he went over to IWA Japan in 1995 and took part in the now famous King of the Deathmatch tournament. There, wrestling amongst barbed wire, glass, thumbtacks, and explosives, and ultimately coming out the victor. So taking notice of this then, WWF, realizing Foley could be a major shot in the arm to their stagnant product, decided to bring the Wild Man in soon after this. But it wouldn't be Cactus Jack he'd be portraying here. No, instead, this would mark the point he morphed into his second alter ego, Mankind. Who was Mankind? Well, he was just as sadistic as Cactus Jack, only in a different way as it happened, because instead of being a Charles Manson-style maniac, he'd be portrayed more like a Hannibal Lecter-esque figure, someone who, with his penchant for tearing his own hair out and squealing like a pig during matches, would be the first figure in the company to regularly get the better of The Undertaker. Of course, as time went on though and fans started to take to Mankind as a lovable freak, he would gradually turn into a more comedic leading babyface, one who regularly brandished a sock puppet around with him called Mr. Socko, and who gained the respect of the audience while he was doing it. But still, that wasn't the most lighthearted of his incarnations as it turned out, because that would come when, upon seeing a videotape Foley had made with his friend as a child, Vince McMahon decided to rebrand him once more as the character he'd played there, Dude Love. Yes, Dude Love. Mick Foley's attempt to be Shawn Michaels would be presented as a ladies' man straight out of the 60s who wanted nothing more than peace, love, and a little bit of fun. So now, with three fully formed characters to choose from, Mrs. Foley's baby boy would alternate between them throughout the rest of his career, depending on what the situation called for, with him at one point even portraying all three during the 1998 Royal Rumble. That said, you don't need three alter egos in order to make a splash. No, if you can get the right one, you'll be set for life with that, and that alone, something which Finn Balor was all too aware of when he developed the Demon. Of course, while the Demon wasn't really a given name until his time with WWE, the idea of Balor leveling up by coming out to the ring clad in body paint is something which stretches all the way back to his days on the UK Indies. Yes, there, he would build an early reputation for himself with his frequent cosplay outfits at live events, such as the time he showed up as Venom, Freddy Krueger, or Heath Ledger's Joker. When he joined Vince McMahon's promotion in 2014, though, copyright worries would mean he'd have to condense this idea into one original figure, with this being what saw him start coming out to the ring during big matches under the guise of the Demon. And the Demon would differentiate himself from Balor by wearing full black and red body paint, as well as a Predator-esque headdress, something which signified that whoever his opponent was that night, they were in for a much tougher task. In fact, between 2014 and 2021, the Demon would never once be defeated. And during his run on NXT in particular, he would beat just about every top star the brand had to offer, with these names including Samoa Joe, Kevin Owens, and Adrian Neville. Then when he graduated to the main roster soon after this, the Demon would be right there to help Balor become the first ever Universal Champion when he defeated Seth Rollins at August 2016's SummerSlam. Of course, this streak would eventually come to an end when he went up against Roman Reigns at 2021's Extreme Rules pay-per-view. But even if his alter ego is now beatable, it hasn't slowed down the Irishman's pace as, with him currently acting as the leader of the Judgment Day, we're sure he's just waiting for the right time to reintroduce his darker side all over again. Of course, that's not to say all alter egos represent a darker side of the person portraying them, however, as sometimes they can be used to push a mystery, such as was the case when Hulk Hogan allegedly portrayed Mr. America in 2003. And we say allegedly because we're still not convinced there's any truth to this one. After all, how could Mr. America and Hulk Hogan be one and the same when he passed a lie detector test in the ring? For argument's sake though, let's just pretend it was the Hulkster behind the mask. It would all have come about when, after he was being forced to sit out the rest of his contract by Vince McMahon following the match the two had gone through at WrestleMania 19, Hogan would come up with the idea of getting back on TV by disguising his identity and referring to himself only as Mr. America. That said, it wasn't like everyone on the planet, Vince McMahon included, wasn't aware of who was really under the mask at this point, as with him using Hogan's Real American theme, as well as a very liberal sprinkling of the word brother, it quickly became clear what was really going on. So the humor in this one then came from the boss's repeated attempts to catch his rival out, with each of them failing in spectacular and hilarious fashion. Yes, at one point during a lie detector test held in the middle of the ring, Mr. America would tell the world that he was not Hulk Hogan, brother, with the machine ultimately deciding that this was the truth, something which only served to infuriate McMahon even further. Unfortunately though, the whole thing would never really get to have a proper payoff as, just a couple of months later, Hogan would leave the company after a pay dispute, with the whole angle being dropped as a result. And he wasn't the only person whose alter ego storyline would be damaged by backstage drama, because when it comes to Bray Wyatt, his whole WWE career could be seen as a fight between him and his bosses. That's right, despite having one of the best characters of his era in the cult Bayou Leader, terrible booking decisions would see Wyatt be relegated to little more than a joke come 2018. So after taking almost a year out to deal with an injury then, Bray would return in April of 2019 with a whole new character, one which initially saw him portray a Mr. Rogers-type children's entertainer, doing backstage segments filmed directly from his Firefly Funhouse. As time went on though, it became clear that the real reason for these segments was to gradually introduce fans to a much darker side of him, one who represented all of the evil within him, the Fiend. And given how cool the look of his alter ego was, what with it having a mask personally made by horror makeup legend Tom Savini, it wouldn't take long for the whole thing to get over with fans in a major way when he finally returned to the ring a few months later. Unfortunately though, while this gimmick did seem like a slam dunk, Vince McMahon's decision to rush him to the main event and put him in a pretty awful Hell in a Cell match with Seth Rollins later that October would see many fans turn on the whole thing. Not that this stopped Bray from powering on through though, because continuing to use his creativity, he was able to bring it back to the forefront for memorable moments such as WrestleMania 36's Firefly Funhouse match with John Cena, or his later feud with Randy Orton, which saw The Fiend pick up his own Harley Quinn in the form of Alexa Bliss. Of course, since then, his issues with management have caused him further problems, leading to him being released from WWE and being yet to appear anywhere else as of the time of this video's recording. But while many are currently speculating that with the recent changes in management over in New York, his return is only a matter of time, one person we're unlikely to be seeing there again anytime soon is Jeff Hardy. And that's because Hardy's notorious personal issues have made him pretty much unemployable at this point, something which is a shame because when he can get himself sober, he's an incredibly creative person, as is evident with his creation of his own alter ego, Will-O-the-Wisp. Now, if you've only ever watched Jeff in WWE or AEW, you may be wondering who Will-O-the-Wisp is. And that's because after creating the gimmick during his early days on the Indies, the former tag team champion wouldn't bring it back again until his time in TNA. Yes, it was in 2014, after Jeff had kayfabe quit the company, that a number of strange vignettes began appearing on Impact TV, hyping up the introduction of a mysterious new figure. And this figure, wearing a mask which looked like something out of a Tim Burton nightmare, would make his in-ring debut soon thereafter then when, at that March's Lockdown pay-per-view, he'd become part of Team MVP during their battle with Team Dixie Carter. Of course, despite the mask, it was never a secret who was under it, with those who didn't remember Willow from Hardy's Omega days quickly being brought up to speed by commentary. What it did do, though, was give a new energy to the man in question, allowing him to start racking up victories once more as he scored pinfalls over the likes of EC3, Rockstar Spud, and James Storm in the weeks that followed. That said, By July of the same year, the time of Willow would ultimately come to an end when, upon realizing that he was needed elsewhere, Jeff would drop the whole thing and return to his more well-known incarnation. But who was it that needed him at this point? Well, it was none other than his own brother, of course, because that would mark the point Matt Hardy also returned to TNA. However, as anyone who was watching at the time will know, this Hardy's reunion would turn out to be relatively short-lived as, after spending a year together and becoming tag team champions once more, Jeff would get injured, forcing them to vacate the belts. So upon spending the next year and a half as a singles wrestler then, Matt would decide he didn't need his brother anymore, a decision which eventually contributed towards him morphing into his broken alter ego. But of course, it was more than just a hatred of Jeff which brought this about as, in storyline, it would be after suffering one too many shots to the head that Matt Hardy underwent something of a psychotic break, with this causing him to develop a ridiculous English accent and an obsession with deleting his opponents. And while this anime supervillain come-to-life character was pretty jarring at first, by the time Matt was done innovating the cinematic match with the final deletion a few weeks later, pretty much everyone was behind the whole thing and how ridiculous it was. In fact, at points, it felt like Hardy and his whole broken universe were the only things keeping TNA afloat, as with his continued cinematic matches and he and his brother's quest to tour the indies and win every tag team title available, he was able to draw a lot of eyeballs to the, at the time, struggling promotion. So this made it a huge blow to them when, after a dispute with management in 2017, both brothers would leave the company, only to return to WWE for another run there. Of course, with a legal battle ensuing about who owned the rights to the character after that though, it would take a while for broken Matt Hardy to appear on WWE TV. And when he eventually did, it would be under the slightly tweaked incarnation of woken Matt Hardy instead. Basically, the original gimmick, but with a distinct name which allowed Vince McMahon to legally copyright it. And though Woken Matt would never really be able to live up to the heights set by its predecessor, it would give us plenty of fun moments, such as the ultimate deletion match between him and Bray Wyatt on the March 19, 2018 episode of Raw. Since then, however, Matt has left WWE to join AEW, where he was able to revive the original broken gimmick for a while, there having more cinematic bouts against the likes of Sammy Guevara and the rest of the Inner Circle. But that's not the last alter ego which was born in Impact Wrestling we're going to be looking at today, of course, because a few years before the Broken Universe had even become a thing, TNA original Abyss was creating his own alter ego in Joseph Park. What made this one more interesting, however, was that, well, Abyss was the monster, a character akin to Kane at his peak, and one who would regularly strike fear into the heart of the rest of the roster. Joseph Park was portrayed more of the regular man behind the curtain. Of course, on screen, he wasn't supposed to be one and the same with Abyss. No, instead, the storyline was that Park was his brother, and that he had arrived in TNA after growing worried about his sibling following his disappearance. So after carrying out an investigation of sorts then, Park would eventually blame Bully Ray for the disappearance, something which led to the two having an Anything Goes match on the July 12, 2012 episode of Impact. And it was on that night that all would seemingly be revealed when, after catching sight of his own blood, Joseph Park snapped and appeared to morph into Abyss in front of everyone's eyes. Still though, he would continue to deny this as the months went on, and so, over the next year, as Park got into a lengthy feud with Aces and Eights, fans were left to wonder if the two were indeed one and the same, something which was made all the murkier when, after Abyss returned to the ring in May of 2013, his brother would continue to claim that they were different people. What was the truth in the matter? Well, that would all be revealed in December of that year when, after the discovery that Joseph Park's supposed law firm had closed 15 years prior, the concerned sibling would fully morph into Abyss during a Monsters Ball match against Bad Influence, putting a close to the whole storyline as, from there, he would start wearing the mask once again. Of course, for as successful as this gimmick was and how much it allowed Abyss to stretch himself creatively, it's not always the case that someone with an alter ego gets to create such an extended storyline out of it. No, sometimes such things are used for more short-term reasons, such as was the case when Mickie James returned to WWE in 2017 under the guise of La Luchadora. Why did she do this? Well, during her prior run with the company, she made quite a name for herself, becoming a multiple-time women's champion in the process. Then, once that was done, she'd gone over to Impact and become a key player in their Knockouts division in the years following this, all before returning to do a one-shot in NXT when she challenged Asuka for that brand's women's belt. So with fans being all too aware of who she was, it meant that when her and Alexa Bliss cooked up a kayfabe plot to get one over on Becky Lynch not long after the second brand split, Mickie would have to hide her identity initially. And this would mean wearing a mask and bodysuit which disguised her as La Luchadora when she interfered in the steel cage match between Bliss and Lynch on the January 17th episode of SmackDown that year. Of course, anyone who was paying close enough attention would notice the nod towards Edge and Christian here, as way back in the Attitude Era, they'd done a similar thing when they briefly wrestled as Los Conquistadors. This time, though, the whole thing wouldn't be played for comedy, as after revealing herself to be the former women's champion, Mickie James would spend the next few months making life a living hell for the man, all before she would then eventually have a change of heart and turn face later that spring. When it comes to someone else's alter ego, though, that's never really managed to turn them face. What it has done, however, is threaten to do this for their rival, Kevin Owens. And that's because taking something that should have been terrible and turning it into one of the more entertaining parts of recent Raw, he, and to a lesser extent Elias, were able to get the tale of Ezekiel over with audiences. Yes, Ezekiel, the alleged twin brother of Elias who showed up on Raw in the spring of 2022 after the latter had been missing in action for some time, claiming that he was there in the place of his sibling. And while, like Mr. America years before, everyone in the audience was in on the joke here, one person who wasn't happy with the whole thing was Kevin Owens. No, fresh off his WrestleMania main event with Stone Cold Steve Austin, KO would find himself drawn into the comedy world of Elias and Ezekiel at this point, with him vowing to prove that they were indeed the same person. Hell, he'd even revive the lie detector gimmick once more for this one, with it having the same results for the heel here as it had for Vince McMahon years prior. And while the focus was largely on Ezekiel and Elias throughout this period, with them constantly finding reasons to not be seen together and, at one point, even using special effects trickery to show them at the same time backstage, it was really Owens who was the star of the whole thing. That's right, while many had hoped that he would get a main event run following WrestleMania, only to then be disappointed when they found out he was being put in a mid-card comedy feud, it turned out to be a testament to just how good Kevin Owens was that his rage over the mystery of Raw's twin siblings became the most entertaining parts of the show every week for a while. Not that Elias didn't play his role well too, of course. No, realizing it was just the kind of thing Vince McMahon would love, he threw himself into it head first, playing up to how ridiculous it all was every time he was on camera. And while the tease of a third brother, Elrod, looks unlikely to be paid off now, what with there being so many recent changes in the creative team at WWE, the whole thing has still managed to give the former Drifter a second lease on life in the company, one he'll surely be looking to ride the wave of for some time yet to come. But when it comes to our final entry today, he doesn't need any further momentum to establish himself because the combination of his long tenure, outside charity work, and unanimous love from his colleagues has pretty much turned him into a made man within the company's mid-card. That said, earlier on in his career, when he was still trying to find himself during his run as part of the Primetime Players, he'd take his own dip into the world of comedy when he introduced fans to Pancake Patterson. And Pancake Patterson, of course, was the alter ego of Titus ONeal, who first appeared on the March 18, 2013 episode of Raw to interrupt a John Cena promo segment, there claiming that he was the uncle of ONeal and his partner Darren Young, and that his nephews deserved to have all the same merchandising opportunities Big Match John did. Of course, his rant and subsequent proclamations that he flattened fools who didn't listen to him would ultimately be cut short when an attack of gout forced him to return to the back. Something which then left the commentary team to wonder if they'd dreamed the whole situation. But they hadn't, and what they'd seen that night then would go on to rank right up there with the strangest alter egos any WWE superstar has ever had. But there's always room for a little strangeness in wrestling though, isn't there? After all, it gives the whole thing more variety. And with all the different alter egos we've looked at today, you can see that variety and the need for it on full display. Yes, whether it be demonic figures, swinging Lotharios, broken psyches, or simple disguises, we think that the examples we've shown you today give a good cross-section of the best alter egos wrestling has to offer, and just further proof that, sometimes, if you want to make it, you have to look to the other sides of yourself to do so. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.